Hello, this is Graham. In this video, we're going to explore a particular approach to counselling and psychotherapy that is very common, can be extremely effective, but has some important caveats in its use. Brief therapy has been around since the earliest days of talking therapy, but it really grew in popularity as a distinctive approach from the early 1970s. It was Carl Rogers, along with Lewis and Schleen, who published two case studies of time-limited, client-centered psychotherapy in 1959 and various papers in the next few years. The earliest published examples tended to be based on specific settings. In 1951 in the probation service, in 1953 for child counselling, and in 1959 by priests delivering pastoral care. In 1975, it was recommended for parent counselling. In 1976, it was endorsed to support smoking cessation. In 1983, for work with suicidal individuals. In 1984, for diplomats and their families returning from foreign postings. And in 1985, for alcohol dependency. Alongside the practical applications, theory evolved too. In 1972, Balint, Ornstein and Balint published a book entitled Focal Psychotherapy, extolling the virtues of shorter-term therapy focused on specific outcomes. In 1973, Mann published Time-Limited Psychotherapy, and in 1973, Malin wrote A Study of Brief Psychotherapy. Alternative names continued to appear. In a psychiatry textbook in 1985, Davenlew described short-term dynamic psychotherapy. By 1986, though, there were comprehensive volumes appearing, such as Research in Brief Psychotherapy by Koss and Bircher, and in 1988, Theory and Practice of Brief Psychotherapy by Budman and Gurman. Interest in brief psychotherapy appears to peak in the 1950s and the 1990s. In each case roughly a decade after interest in CBT does. Both, of course, are appealing because of the reduced cost and speed to implement them. To understand the context of brief therapy, it helps to consider why people choose to have therapy. There are probably many reasons, but in a nutshell there are three. Some people have serious mental health issues, and talking therapy is one aspect of a package of support that they receive. Some people have less extreme mental well-being issues. They might suffer from anxiety, depression, or a general sense of loss of purpose, and they either seek counselling themselves or their GP might advise them to. Some people are not aware of any issues with their well-being, but they are making sense of their life journey, and they see therapy as an important way of navigating this. Brief therapy is constrained in the number of sessions that it consists of. Typically, it covers somewhere between 4 and 12 sessions, though some commercial practices, such as EAPs, Employee Assistance Programs, work around 6 sessions. One of the early writers about brief therapy considered it to be anything less than 1 year. Most core therapy models expect the client to be working with their therapist for a substantial period of time, and for this to be open-ended with regular reviews between the client and their therapist. Against this backdrop, brief therapy can't tackle the full story in one block of, say, 6 sessions. Brief therapy will often appeal to people who haven't had any experience of counselling before. They will often present with a fairly specific issue, a tough decision, a relationship problem, or family dynamics, for instance. Brief therapy won't suit everyone, though. The person with complex mental health issues will need longer-term and open-ended support. The person on a life quest will probably want the longer-term offer too, though they may turn to a brief therapist to help them with specifics. However, for people with less severe mental well-being issues, perhaps suffering from anxiety, depression, or a loss of purpose, a series of, say, 6 sessions can be very helpful. And if they're paying for it themselves, it can seem far less of a commitment. Because time is limited, there are some things that the brief therapist does and doesn't do that might be different from an open-ended approach. Firstly, they will be a little more structured in their approach. This doesn't mean that they're prescriptive, and they can still be highly person-centered if that's their modality. But to give the client the maximum benefit in a shorter time, they avoid too much digression. They don't go into teaching mode, at least not in great depth. They may be a little more goal-focused, more on that in a moment, and they plan their beginnings, middles, and ends carefully. The brief therapist maintains a clear boundary around the time limit. They may accept an extra week or two, but if the client needs greater support, the brief therapist will encourage them to accept a referral to another therapist with a different contract. In this sense, brief therapists are what we would today perhaps call a pluralistic counsellor. Brief therapists draw on the idea common in CBT of homework. They will try not to overload their client, but structured tasks between sessions are not uncommon. Perhaps the most unusual practice, though, compared to recent approaches in other modalities, is that they tend to record their sessions on audio or video. These recordings are usually given to the participant after the session, so that they can reinforce the learning from it. And in turn, the therapist will review the recordings, either alone or with a peer supervision group. 3 more factors make the brief therapist potentially different from others, or at least they're aspects that are more common among the brief therapy community than elsewhere. The therapist is more goal or outcome oriented. They aren't ridiculously rigid, but once the client and therapist have agreed on a realistic outcome for their sessions, the therapist maintains boundaries carefully. A client who digresses, who puts urgent ahead of important, who finds other ways of avoiding the topic that they agreed they would work on, is likely to be sabotaging this and other aspects of their life. Alongside being outcome-oriented, the therapist also works on themes rather than concerns. A client who is worried about something and comes into brief therapy might be shown that their anxiety arises from a more pervasive attitude of fear or impossibility or lack of rights. These in turn might lead to an agreed outcome for them to recognise when their attitude affects their perception and to manage this more appropriately. Finally, brief counsellors have a focus on change. Using whatever model of change suits their modality, they prepare their client and may accompany them through their initial steps. However, they're realistic, and so they also prepare the client for setbacks. Within almost every modality, there are advocates of the use of homework, or between sessions activity, and there are those who see it as problematic. Within the relationship-based modalities such as person-centered, transpersonal and psychodynamic, the act of defining homework can be seen as a shift in the power balance away from one of equal partnership. In those approaches, though, there are also people who would argue that such a partnership is a fanciful notion, as the therapist is always an authority figure of some kind. There is, however, strong evidence that personal agency is crucial to the success of therapy, and homework plays an important role in this. Ideally, the therapist and client negotiate over the use of homework and its content. With the right client, to support their own autonomy, the brief therapist might engage them in the process of designing that homework too. The therapist will choose from a fairly wide array of possible tools, and they will devote some sufficient time in the session to brief the client. They may have excerpts from books for the client to read, subjects for them to research, writing tasks such as drafting letters to significant people, completing psychometric instruments, keeping a record of observations about themselves such as their mood, to the incidence of specific behaviours. Behavioural tasks, simple actions that might be repeated several times, such as putting post-it notes on mirrors with short mantras, weighing themselves each morning, and so on. And then there are visual or imagery tasks, perhaps using Pinterest to find images that express something, or listening to a guided visualization each day. The therapist must honour the effort put in by the client, making sure that time is allowed to explore the learning from it, the experience of doing the homework, and any resistances or challenges that are experienced. The therapist may also set themselves work between sessions so that they're better equipped to empathise with the client's experience.